I'm going to need a lesson in recording, Warren, one of these days, but not now.
Well, they're all in YouTube. They're all on my YouTube channel. So anytime you want to go back and review, I have a recording for every one of these sessions. So.
Oh, cool.
So what's the name of the same?
I'll give it to you. It's my YouTube channel. Crabs and Beer.
Crabs and Beer.
Yeah. I also have videos that I created from scratch on there, just playing around, plus videos of me playing the piano and that kind of stuff, music videos.
Dennis, maybe we could put exercise on his channel, and then if anybody wants the exercise class, they can go grab here.
Yeah. We don't have to.
Then we don't have to keep
make
a
up
channel.
our own, use our own infrastructure.
Go to Warren's YouTube channel.
Yeah.
You missed exercise.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll give us permission to put stuff out there.
Right.
Oh, yeah. As long as it's not copyrighted.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, no. Okay, so we'll get started, and we'll just alternate the verses when we get to them. You remember last week, we went through a couple of kings. Again, we're focusing just on the small Israel, the northern kingdom. And we went through a number of different kings. They came and went, and we left off with Omri, who was the army commander, if you recall. And when he had heard that the king was assassinated, he grabbed all his troops and went home and laid siege to Tirzah. So today we're going to cover Omri, which is almost nothing in the Bible about him, so we won't spend a lot of time on him. And then we'll move on to Ahab, his son. Omri was the king who succeeded in reestablishing Israel in close coalition with Judah as a major power in the southern Syrian and greater Palestine. Up until this time, the kingdom is still split. They're still north and south, but Omri had managed to form an alliance with the southern part of the kingdom, which is now called Judah. So they had a close tie. They still didn't join. Surprisingly enough, however, nothing of his deeds, speaking of Omri, has been preserved in the Bible. Any Jewish king who didn't bow to the crown of David and didn't accept the uniqueness of the Temple of Jerusalem, which means practically any king in the northern kingdom, is mentioned in the Bible only insofar as it mattered to the relevance of representing the history of the southern kingdom, Judah. Which sort of explains why a lot of the events that we talked about last week, the chronological period was described as during the 14th year of Asa's reign, the king down in Judah. This was going on in the north. And on the 27th year of Asa's reign, this was going on in the north. So there's very little mentioned about the northern kings, except for the fact that if it was important to the history of the southern kingdom, Judah. We only have two maps. Let me bring the first one up. Here we go. Uh-oh. It's Art. That's okay.
What's up,
Later
Art?
never.
Look at the crowd, Warren.
Yeah.
I know.
This is the first
I know.
Warren, this is the first one I could make this week. And I almost missed this, didn't I?
Well, that's okay. This one's being recorded like all the others, so if you want to go back and catch the first 5 minutes.
I'm sure it was a bunch of mayhem and murder and attacking from the rear, so I didn't miss much.
Yeah. No.
Palace intrigue.
So it's from sources that are outside the Bible, and I'm speaking about the inscription on the stele, S-T-E-L-E, stele is how it's pronounced, and there's a picture of it up in the corner here, the stele of Shalmaneser III. So it's the inscription that's on the stele of Mesha, who was the king of Moab, that we learn that Omri had conquered Moab again, from which we may infer that Ammon, where Ramoth Gilead is located, Ammon too must have come under his sway. The Bible sort of mentions in passing the foundation of Omri's new capital, Samaria. Remember that Tirzah was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel under the previous kings. But once Omri became king, he moved the capital to Samaria. Archaeological excavations have uncovered sizable portions of the Israelite capital. They found strong and intricate fortifications, a sumptuous palace, storehouses, and various administrative buildings. One of the main sources of Omri's economic strength was his intensification of the traditional alliance with the Phoenicians, which were the seafaring peoples of the northern coast of the Mediterranean. The closeness of this alliance can be inferred from the fact that it was cemented by the marriage of his son Ahab to Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Tyre, located right here. The political and the economic survival of the Phoenician seafaring coastal state depended a lot on their ability to secure their food-producing lands and the trade routes that led to their lands from the coast up into the mountains and so forth. So this was generally achieved by the Phoenicians entering into a pact with the most suitable, and you can read that as usually the strongest of their neighbors at any given time. So the reemergence of Israel was viewed with great concern by the Damascenes, Damascus, up here to the north. And in the days of Ahab, who succeeded Omri around 870 BC, Ben-Hadad II decided to launch a preemptive war before Israel could grow too strong, and possibly launch a war of its own to regain the former lands that Solomon had conquered in his time, and the possessions on the Golan Heights and further north and east. So we've moved on from Omri. That's all we have on Omri. And basically, he was a king. He succeeded in forming an alliance with the southern kingdom. He moved the capital from Tirzah to Samaria. And he kept a strong alliance with the Phoenicians. That's basically all we know. So now we're going to move on to the next king, his son Ahab. So, Jim, if you got the first reading, 1 Kings 20, verse 1.
I do. Well, I'm not muted. Now, Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mustered his entire army, accompanied by 32 kings with their horses and chariots. He went up and besieged Samaria and attacked it.
So, Ben-Hadad led a coalition of all the Aramean rulers who had become alarmed by Israel's regained strength. And in the initial stage of his campaign, he succeeded in outmaneuvering the Israelite king. Ahab was still with the elders and the district governors in Samaria deciding on what strategy to choose, when all of a sudden Ben-Hadad and the whole Aramean army appeared right outside their walls and began to lay siege to the city. So now he was cut off from the major part of his regular army, which was either still in its garrisons around the country, or they'd been cleverly evaded by Ben-Hadad on his approach march to Samaria. Ahab had with him, for consultation, the functionaries and the commanders of the reserve forces. The national levy, the reserves, had either not yet been called up or had not yet been deployed. And anyhow, it was cut off from its leaders and chief staff officers. So the situation of the Israelite forces here might be compared to that of the British forces in North Africa, when during the initial stages of the German surprise attack on March 31st, 1941, their commanding officers, General O'Connor and General Niệm, and their companions walked right into a German patrol and were taken prisoner. Ahab's situation seemed desperate at this time. So to gain time and to avert the worst, Ahab decided he was prepared to accept whatever the terms were that Ben-Hadad was going to offer. Well, when Ben-Hadad heard this, he's thinking, Ahab's will has been broken, his will to resist. Maybe I'll just up the ante. So he increased the terms of surrender to mean complete and humiliating prostration, and it seems that this is what Ahab was looking for. He was waiting for something like this to develop so he could use this degrading terms offered by Damascus to rouse the indignation of his counselors, and once he was backed by their support, he was able to reject the Aramean offer. So Ben-Hadad didn't take Ahab's refusal as a major problem. He believed that Samaria's fall was just a foregone conclusion, so he settled down to a long, leisurely siege, well screened by his chariots from any possible outside interference, and secure in the thought that his army was superior. The Bible does record the number of troops that were with King Ahab in the walls of Samaria, and it was no more than 8,000. Ben-Hadad's confidence may have been gathered from his reaction to Ahab's refusal to submit. Dennis and Pat, you got 1 Kings 20, verse 10.
Then Ben-Hadad sent another message to Ahab. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if enough dust remains in Samaria to give each of my men a handful.
So he was going to level the place. Okay, when he got that refusal, he said, I'm going to level the place. Ahab's proverbial answer is still used today. It's a famous saying in Hebrew to this very day. So Art, if you can read 1 Kings 20, verse 11.
The king of Israel answered, tell him, one who puts on his armor should not boast like one who takes it off.
That's what you call
Yeah.
in modern military jargon, we would call that dropping the mic. So at this, Ben-Hadad then ordered the preparation for a full general assault, but of course Ahab anticipated that's what would happen. The Israelite forces were formed into two divisions. The first was a small force of 232 men that was made up of the Ne'arim, which are hand-picked soldiers who formed the bodyguards of all the provincial governors that were in town for this big meeting. When Ben-Hadad, who was drinking with his allies, the other 32 kings from Aram, they were in their huts, what they had rapidly erected outside the city walls, because they figured they were going to be here a long time. So he learned of this small number, and he was of two minds about what their purpose might be. Of course, he was kind of mellowed out by all the wine, so he treated the matter as a joke. So, Jim, if you got 1 Kings 20, verse 18.
He said, if they have come out for peace, take them alive. If they have come out for war, take them alive.
So what happens next is anybody's guess. But there is a biblical rendition of what happened next, and that's 1 Kings 20, 19 to 22. There, Dennis or Pat?
The junior officers under the provincial commanders marched out to the city with the army behind them, and each one struck down his opponent. At that, the Arameans fled with the Israelites in pursuit. But Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, escaped on horseback with some of the horsemen. The king of Israel advanced and overpowered the horses and chariots and inflicted heavy losses on the Arameans.
Okay, so it would appear that the Arameans treated this small Jewish force that made its way out of the city in the afternoon, marching down the slope of the hill on which Samaria was built in full sight of the enemy, like so much prey to be taken alive. But the Ne'arim were just serving as a decoy. While the general attention was focused on them, the rest of the reserve forces that were in the walls of Samaria poured out from all the various gates and entrances all around the fortress and attacked the regiments that were surrounding the fortress. And of course, they were not very thick at any one location, and it caught them completely by surprise. The Israelite force must have included the household chariots, which were quartered in Samaria, other elite units that formed the king's guard, and the Arameans were astonished at these guys just pouring out everywhere. And since all of their leaders were drinking in a tent with Ben-Hadad, they had no leadership with them at the time. And so sudden was the general rout that ensued that Ben-Hadad's royal chariot couldn't be made ready in time, so he ended up jumping on the horse and escaping with some other troops. The fleeing Arameans were forced to pass within striking distance of one or more of the Israelite army bases, such as, we move down here, Shem, located here, Tirzah, Megiddo, and probably even Hatzor. And a considerable part of their flight took them through the mountainous territory and the steep defiles, which were death traps for retreating army units, even as late as the year 1918. The alerted Israelite garrisons around the country, as well as the spontaneous turnout of the people in arms, may have inflicted more damage on the fleeing Arameans than were suffered in the first fight. This Ben-Hadad's debacle at Samaria was closely scrutinized by himself and his aides. So let's see, who's up next? Art, 1 Kings 20, 23 to 25.
Meanwhile, the officials of the king of Aram advised him, "Their gods are gods of the hills. That is why they were too strong for us. But if we fight them on the plains, surely we will be stronger than they. Do this. Remove all the kings from their commands and replace them with other officers. You must also raise an army like the one you lost, horse for horse and chariot for chariot, so we can fight Israel on the plains. Then surely we will be stronger than they." He agreed with them and acted accordingly.
So if we were to translate the causes for the defeat of the Arameans at Samaria into modern military jargon, we would come up with the following. Number one, entanglement in terrain unsuitable for the deployment and operation of the Aramean wheeled and mounted shock troops. Number two, decentralization of command and all the other drawbacks that are endemic in a coalition of many partners. And the remedy that was proposed and accepted was, number one, maneuvering so as to force the Israelites to fight in terrain that was suited to the Aramean arms and Aramean tactics. Number two, prior to that, setting the Aramean house in order by reshaping the Damascene state from a loose tribal confederation of 32 kings into a single centralized state. And three, rebuilding and re-equipping the Aramean army to a strength equal to that before their defeat. This program required a considerable amount of time and preparation. Yes, you got a question here, Art?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. At this point in time, were all of these armies standing armies, or they were pulled together? Because I asked that because it appears they're still screwing up in battle. They get caught, they're sleeping, they're out drinking. So I wonder, what do you say?
Yeah, they were not, because they were a loose tribal confederation, there were basically 32 small little itty bitty armies. The Damascus was the largest and the most sophisticated. So there was a standing army, but they weren't very big individually. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Explains it.
Yeah. um, and when I say the decentralization of command, that's something that's like in today's modern army, you won't find that. Um, in the modern army of today, you have at various levels of command, like you'll have a battalion commander, and the battalion will be made up of companies, and there are company commanders. Companies will be made up of platoons, and there are platoon commanders, platoon leaders, and then they're broken down into squads, and you got squad leaders. In the American military, and if you watched what was the D-Day movie with Tom Hanks, Saving Private Ryan, you know, at any given moment, any soldier could find himself, now you're the leader. And that was common, that when the leader was taken out for whatever reason, the next guy down immediately took command. That was automatic. Unlike the Soviet military, take for example a tank platoon. Say you have 6 Soviet tanks, and one of those tanks, there's the tank platoon commander. If that tank platoon commander is taken out, the rest of the tanks stop dead. They don't do a thing because they don't become the leaders, and nobody will accept it. As soon as they become leaderless, that's it. Well, this is basically what happened here. All of the leaders that were encamped around Samaria were all in one place in a tent drinking with Ben-Hadad. So all the troops that were surrounding the city were leaderless. So when all of a sudden the Israelites poured out, they didn't know what to do because they didn't have somebody to tell them what to do. So it happened then, it still happens today, depending on where you are. So Ahab was now fully prepared because he had the time to prevent Ben-Hadad from launching his offensive and reaching the Israelite territory. The Israelite army attacked, but although it succeeded in gaining the Golan Plateau, which is on this map depicted as the Bashan, on the Golan Plateau, the Arameans could halt this momentum. Ben-Hadad was in time to lock the narrow defile that was created by 2 parallel river gorges, leaving only a steep and narrow ridge on the approach to the town of Aphek, which served him as a rear base. The 2 armies were facing each other at the 2 ends of this defile for 8 days. Then King Ahab attacked and routed his enemy. The Bible doesn't give any hint as to how the Israelite victory was achieved. The Aphek defile that we're talking about here is no more than 330 feet wide for about 440 yards. So a frontal assault was not going to work. There does exist, however, 2 flanking approaches. The northern approach passes over the Sesuda Ridge, and the southern one, or the southern ones, consists of 3 or 4 steep footpaths that lead up the northern slope of the Wadi Barbara Gorge. During the 8 days of watching his enemy, Ahab had plenty of time to reconnoiter these outflanking approaches and to make up the assault parties that he was going to use to turn the Damascene flank. The Aramean soldiers were already keyed up the whole time, looking at their opponent down this narrow defile, and they were suspicious of any moves that were occurring in the defile. They must have become jumpy and then became less alert by the end of the week. So when the Israelites suddenly appeared in their rear, you guessed it, Art, and possibly there was a concerted frontal attack at the same time on this defile, the Aramean front broke and the fugitives ran for the fortress town of Aphek, whose defenses literally crumbled under the press of people that were seeking refuge within the walls. Famous battles of more recent history, such as Blenheim, fought by the Duke of Marlborough in 1704, or Luthungen, that was fought by Frederick II of Prussia in 1757, have proved that even a more controlled withdrawal, the overflow of retreating troops, makes the defense of a town of refuge impossible. The sheer mass of people impedes the movement in the narrow streets and alleyways, and it makes their tactical employment practically useless. So this fact was recognized by Ben-Hadad, who decided to give himself up and throw himself at the feet of King Ahab in a passionate appeal for mercy. And much to the disgust of many of the Israelites that were with King Ahab, the king showed great restraint. And in return for a pledge to renounce any claim on the former Israelite towns that had been captured by the Arameans, and his consent to the establishment of an extraterritorial and otherwise privileged Israelite trade facility in the city of Damascus itself, Ben-Hadad was released and given safe conduct home. So remember last week we talked about the Naphtali line, the towns of Ijon, Dan, Abel Beth-Makkah, and Hatzor, and Chennereth, as all had been captured by the Arameans. So King Ahab is saying, all right, I'm going to let you go, but I want all these towns back. Not only that, I want a trade facility in Damascus with special privileges. So Ben-Hadad agreed, gave him escort home safely. King Ahab's gesture was more than just in character with his nature. He was also a far-sighted ruler. For once he had hoped that his gesture towards his almost hereditary foe might break this vicious cycle of continuous wars. He therefore refrained from making the terms of surrender and the form of victory too humiliating for the Arameans, whom he knew he had no power really to control effectively in the long run, and with whom he simply had to learn to live with. Furthermore, King Ahab was most probably aware of the reemergence to the north of the Assyrians as a great expansionist power, and he saw a need to preserve the available resources and forces of all of Syria, including the Arameans and Palestine, for a major united effort to stem the tide of the Assyrian tide that was coming from the north. Yes? Oh, okay. So it only took about 2 years for matters to come to a head and for the Assyrian invasion to materialize. So don't confuse Assyria with Arameans. They're different. The Assyrians are even further north of Aram. They're the northernmost neighbor to Aram. In the 6th year of his reign, Shalmaneser III began his great war of conquest to subdue the lands west of the Euphrates. The strength of the Assyrian war machine can only be guessed, but it was undoubtedly the most sophisticated and complex the ancient world had known up to this point. This fact becomes apparent from studying the reliefs on the bronze gates at Balawat in ancient Iraq, on which some of Shalmaneser's campaigns are depicted. They show variously armed corps of infantry fighting alongside chariots, with a crew of 3, and cavalry armed with lances, spears, bows. Some of the troops are cased in heavy armor. The siege train included, besides the well-known breaching tools and scaling ladders, mobile 4- and 6-wheeled rams covered with sheet metal and or hides. Boats, rafts, inflated animal skins served the first line as a river crossing equipment. The Assyrian cavalry, not the chariots, but the cavalry, appears here to be at its fullest development. Its tactical employment was often in mixed units, either with infantry or variously armed horsemen. Experiments in minor tactics included the combat group of 2 troopers, one an archer and the other that was differently armed and shielding the archer when shooting his bow, much like the heavy foot archers who were covered by a shield-bearing comrade. Mounted troops were introduced to some extent in the Israelite armed forces as well, though they were never attained the prominence that the chariots had retained throughout the whole existence of the northern kingdom. Go switch maps here.
Ooh.
Boom. There we go. The Assyrian army reached the upper Orontes. Here's the Orontes River and the Orontes Valley right here. Just so you're oriented, here's Samaria, here's Hatzor, Tyre. So we're pretty far north. We're way up the coast here. Here's Damascus. Here's Tadmor. You remember that during Solomon's reign, Tadmor was a trade outpost for caravans halfway between Damascus and the Euphrates River. Remember that? We talked about that. So just to orient you. So here's the Orontes Valley. The Assyrian army reached the upper Orontes Valley by moving southwards, and it found its way blocked by the Syro-Palestinian allied armies, which had drawn up in full battle array on the marches of Karkar. Shalmaneser's annals have preserved the order of battle of forces that were allied against him. Hadadezer, Ben-Hadad II of Damascus, 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalry, 10,000 foot soldiers. Rehulani of Hamath, 700 chariots, 700 cavalry, 10,000 foot soldiers. King Ahab of Israel, 2,000 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers. Ki, 500 foot soldiers. 1,000 soldiers from Mosri, which was either from Syria or Egypt, not really sure. Arkad, 10 chariots, 10,000 soldiers. Arvad, 200 soldiers. Usanata, 200 soldiers. Shian, 30 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers. 1,000 soldiers from Ammon. Gindabu the Arab, 1,000 camel riders. So in total, the Allies mustered 3,940 chariots, 1,900 horsemen, 1,000 camel riders, and 52,900 foot soldiers. Keep in mind now, we're talking about King Ahab had defeated Ben-Hadad, but he didn't humiliate him because he knew because of the Assyrian threat, I might need this guy. So now Ben-Hadad and King Ahab and all the other kings around the area are now combined into an allied army to face the Assyrians. Yes, Art?
Did all those people in the army speak the same language? And the second part of the question is, who in the heck would coordinate that mess? How did that work on the
Exactly. In fact, I was going to get into that a little bit.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. So this list is one of the most illuminating documents on the military history of this period. The Assyrian, now remember that list was put together by the Assyrians. In other words, the enemy put that list together. They counted the people that what they were up against. The relatively modest number of each participant's contribution to the coalition army has to be taken at face value. Of course, these figures don't represent the complete strength of these respective armies, but they serve as a good yardstick as far as the size of the forces engaged in major campaigns is concerned. There was no way that Ben-Hadad was going to put his entire army into this campaign. There was no way King Ahab was going to put his entire army into this. So these were just the forces that made up the coalition. Another interesting point is the meager contributions of the Phoenician maritime cities. You know, I mentioned like Arvad, for example, and the absence of any mention of others, like Tyre was not even mentioned. Because they're chiefly naval powers, they must have alerted their fleets to, you know, provide whatever naval support necessary while their contribution to the warfare on land would have been confined to token forces, like I think Arvad contributed 10 chariots, for example. Ahab was listed third by the Assyrian attackers, but he must have been among one of the prime movers, if not the central figure of this coalition. Ben-Hadad could not have assumed that position so shortly after his crushing defeat by King Ahab. Although Ahab's cavalry force, if present, was so small it was not even mentioned here, but he had by far the largest chariot contingent. The Israelite chariot corps was 800 chariots stronger than Ben-Hadad's contribution, which was the next strongest on the list. The capacity of the stables at Megiddo has been calculated by archaeologists at 492 horses, which means that to maintain a cavalry corps of 2,000 chariots, you would need 12 other chariot and store cities of similar capacity. Ahab's alliance with Tyre may explain part of his capacity to finance this extensive force. Another possibility is that part or all of his additional strength can be explained if forces from his sister kingdom, Judah, had been added into the mix. But we don't know that for sure. But it's probably likely. The relatively small number of Israelite foot soldiers is explained by Ahab's reluctance to strip his country of all the armed forces, leaving him to fight another day if this expedition into northern Syria proved to be a failure. Besides, he had to leave sufficient forces behind to keep Moab, down here to his south, at bay, and to guard against his borders against the raiders from the eastern desert. So, while the regular troops were engaged in the campaign in the north, the hometown reservists protected the homeland. The logistics effort involved in moving, feeding, and maintaining an army of no less than 15,000 men and its supply train, which was roughly from when they started to when they reached the battlefield, 300 miles. Comparison with early 20th century staff tables proves that if we just take the Boer War as an example, a march of this extent took about 30 days. This calculation, however, does not include ox carts or camel trains, which move at a speed of about 2 miles per hour and slow up marching columns considerably. The sheer length of the Israelite marching columns comprising the expeditionary force is estimated to be about 6 miles long, which necessitated a high standard of discipline and limited means of communication. Each horse had to have about 4 pounds of fodder. If green fodder could not be provided, oxen would have consumed about 3 pounds of fodder for every 20 pounds of its own weight. The Israelite army alone, daily consumption of water amounted to, for all purposes, an average of 110,000 gallons a day. Although most of the marching was done through friendly territory and most of the supplies might have been provided by bases that were established near the march route, the methods and the routine employed to safeguard the necessary supply at the right time, at the right point, depots and bases meant a high degree of staff planning and staff routine. The more so because we're dealing with multilingual, multinational alliance, as Art pointed out. In spite of all these handicaps, all these allied forces arrived at Karkar in good order, and they succeeded not only in beating back the Assyrian army, but they mauled it so severely that for the time being, Shalmaneser, and I'll say for the time being, Shalmaneser gave up any further military designs on Syria and the Palestinian land bridge. No mention is made of the Karkar campaign in the Bible. And it's to the credit of archaeologists that uncovered the Assyrian annals that were chiseled in stone and bearing the story of this event have come to light. That's the only reason we know about this at all. The Bible, for reason of its own, takes up the thread of history sometime after Ahab's return to Israel, when he was really at the top of his might and the top of his prestige. So who's got the next reading? 1 Kings 22, 2 through 4. I lost track.
That's me. I believe I
Okay.
do. Yep. But in the third year, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went down to see the king of Israel. The king of Israel said to his officials, "Don't you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and yet we are doing nothing to retake it from the king of Aram?" So he asked Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to fight against Ramoth Gilead?" Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses."
So as you can see, I'm going to move on from this map. Remember I said Shalmaneser gave up any designs of trying to take control of this area for the time being. But as you can see, and we'll talk about this later, the Assyrian Empire eventually covered all of this land. They took control over all of this area. Southeast Asia, Babylon, all the way down to Egypt, all of the Palestinian land bridge, except, you notice this little circle? The kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel is gone, but Judah is still hanging on. The entire Syrian Empire could not grab a hold of this little piece of land in Judah, because this is where
Nothing's
Jerusalem
changed
was.
in that area.
Huh?
I see nothing has changed in that area.
Yeah,
Nothing.
nothing. It reminds me of a joke, but I won't tell it.
Okay.
Okay. So we saw this map earlier, and this is the only two maps that you'll see today. Jehoshaphat. Now, who was Jehoshaphat? He was the king of
Judah.
Judah at this point in history. King Ahab is still king in the northern kingdom. Jehoshaphat is now king in the southern kingdom. And Jehoshaphat arrived in the capital of Israel, in Samaria, the new capital, for one of the periodic consultations between the two sister kingdoms. Remember, back in Omri's day, he formed this alliance. And part of that treaty was, we're going to get together regularly and talk over things that are important to our two kingdoms. So Jehoshaphat arrived in Samaria for one of his periodic consultations, which had been going on since the conclusion of the treaty. Since Ben-Hadad had not kept his promise given after his defeat at Aphek to restore all the former Israelite towns, and he held on to the northern fringe of Gilead, Ahab now proposed to his ally, Jehoshaphat, a common effort to retrieve by force what was his by right. And Jehoshaphat's immediate, unreserved declaration of complete cooperation was prompted by three considerations. Number one, his confidence in Ahab's military leadership. Number two, his understanding of the importance of regaining the Yarmouk River, right here, as a border for the security of both kingdoms. And number three, his appreciation for the strategic and economic advantage of holding Ramoth Gilead here, which was along the King's Highway, which was a major north-south route on the fringe of the desert. And we talked about that as one of the major north-south routes. It straddled the King's Highway, and it was the gateway to the rich grain-bearing regions west of the Horon Mountains, grazing areas beyond, where the Jewish settlers were always hard-pressed by various tribes and peoples trying to infringe on their lands. Now, I should have mentioned before that narrow defile that you talked about at Aphek. where after the battle, they ran into the fortress and he eventually gave up. Ben-Hadad gave up. You notice that Aphek here has a question mark beside it. The reason for that is they're not sure if this is the Aphek they're talking about, because way down here to the south, there's another Aphek, question mark. And right up here on the fringe of the Jezreel Valley, there's another Aphek, question mark. So which one of these Apheks did this battle occur where Ben-Hadad surrendered? Most of the scholars believe it was here, and it seems to make the most sense. And the fact that there's maybe two towns of the same name, when you consider that we're talking here about two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, it's not unlikely that they could have, I mean, how many towns in America have common names?
Sure.
There's Richmond, Indiana, and there's Richmond, Virginia. So, but they mostly agree that this is the Aphek they're talking about. But now that time is gone. Ben-Hadad didn't give up these towns. He didn't give up Dan. He didn't give up Hatzor. He kept them. So Jehoshaphat and Ahab got together and they said, we're going to take them back by force. So on the eve of the battle at Ramoth Gilead, which had been occupied by the Damascenes, Ben-Hadad had some anxious hours contemplating his past defeats at the hand of Ahab. So in briefing his officers, he made known his awe of Ahab's superior military leadership, and he considered him more dangerous than all the troops. So I think, Dennis, you're next, or Pat, 1 Kings 22 to 31.
Now the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel.
Okay. Was that? Let's see. Yep, got it. So when the armies met on the following day, hand-picked chariot troops attacked with the sole mission of hunting down King Ahab and killing him. When one of these units attacked King Jehoshaphat of Judah by mistake, it immediately broke contact when the king of Judah was properly identified. Ahab had been at the front of the attack from the very start, but by chance he had escaped the attention of the units of charioteers that were sent to trap him. But while the battle was raging, a stray arrow struck between the joints of his armor and entered deep into his body. Seriously wounded, he was unable to carry on the assault personally. At the same time, however, the Aramean opposition was still strong, so Ahab was afraid of leaving the battlefield even for a short time to dress his wounds, in case his action might be misinterpreted by his troops and led to an Israelite retreat. So Art, you got 2 Chronicles 18:34.
All day long the battle raged, and the king of Israel propped himself up in his chariot facing the Arameans until evening. Then at sunset he died.
So by heroically bleeding to death and hiding his mortal wound from the eyes of his troops until evening, and only then collapsing in mortal exhaustion, Ahab had averted a disaster. Yet before the armies were able to renew their struggle on the following morning, the news of Ahab's death spread among the troops, and in the absence of any other outstanding leader to use this news to create anger and a call for revenge, the Israelites and the Judeans retreated, every man to his own city, every man to his own country. So, Jim, you got 1 Kings 22, 35, and 36?
Yes. All day long the battle raged, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. And the blood from his wound ran onto the floor of his chariot, and that evening he died. As sun was setting, a cry spread through the army, every man to his town, every man to his land.
Okay. And that's what we have for today.
That's it.
So we covered the last little bit of King Omri, spent quite a bit of time on King Ahab and his conflicts. Next week we'll be discussing, we're still staying with the small Israel. Next week we'll be talking about Israel, the northern kingdom, after Ahab.
Cool.
So, any questions? Had some good questions along the way. Thank you for that.
Got one.
Keeps me on my toes.
Yeah. Warren,
Yes, sir.
early in the presentation, you talked briefly about chariots as a screening force. What
Yes.
number of chariots would cause concern for any foot soldiers? If I saw one, yeah, okay. What number would put a little fear into them if they saw chariots coming at you?
Well, I don't think there's any way to know that. I would suspect that probably, obviously, they would not travel singularly. So it was probably commanders of 10, and if you had 2 individuals in each chariot, that was probably 5 chariots led by like a platoon leader, a captain of 10, which in our army would be a corporal. So I would guess probably 5 chariots, but you have to remember that there was 5 chariots here and 5 chariots here and 5 chariots here and 5 chariots here. They were like, their whole purpose was to screen the area from where the siege was taking place before the city walls to some distance prior to that, just so they wouldn't be surprised by any attack.
So they were.
I would also suspect that the amount of chariots that were assigned to any particular sector around the city would also depend on the terrain around the city. If it was wide open plains around the city, not many chariots could cover a large area. Whereas if it was a very rugged area, you'd have to have more chariots to cover all the different defiles and gorges and approaches.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I would do if I was in charge.
You've got a lot of experience with chariots, I heard.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Yeah, you were there.
Well, my very first unit when I entered the Army, my very first unit was the 1st Cavalry Division.
Mm.
I used to tell these grandkids, hey, Pops, you Vietnam era war? Go, yeah. And I said, you little scamps, we had some jets. It wasn't all propellers.
Yeah, and the 1st Cavalry Division, when I went in, we didn't have horses. We had helicopters.
Mm.
Yes, you did.
Right.
I love the Cavs. Oh, did I? No, I didn't end the recording, did I? No.